Thank you all. Good Yontif. And I wanted to just thank you all for joining us tonight. And tonight is Christmas Eve. And this is a time of the year when many of us try and figure out what are we going to do tonight and tomorrow. And we each have our own personal stories and memories of being Jewish at Christmas in America or in other lands. And I'd like to start with my own story. And I'll share from time to time some images. So let's look at the first image. The first image is an image of me sitting on the next image. Here's a picture of the book, and here's an image of me sitting on Santa Claus's lap at the age of 7. Around 1964. And you may ask, why would I be sitting on Santa Claus's lap in Great Neck, Long Island in New York, the son of a Reform rabbi who was a civil rights leader, Rabbi Walter Plaut, who was a freedom rider. And as I was writing my PhD dissertation on being Jewish at Christmas in America, I called up my mother, who was in her late 70s, and I said, how could you in Great Neck take me to be part of a Christmas celebration at the department store, Gert's department store, and sit on Santa Claus's lap? And she said, why not? All Americans go and take their children to sit on Santa Claus's lap, and you were secure in your Jewish identity, and so it was part of an American holiday seasonal tradition. And so I laughed and I accepted her story. And on the other hand, I have a different type of story. So to me, Christmas was a night in which we would go to Rockefeller Center. We would go ice skating. We'd have hot chocolate. It would be snowing. We'd drive around Great Neck and we'd see the Christmas lights. So I was ambivalent. And at the age of 10, I moved to Israel in 1967. And there I had no connection with Christmas, it being a Jewish state. A second personal story is that of my wife, Lori, who grew up in Colchester, Connecticut, in a small Jewish community. And when she was growing up, she had holiday concerts in the high school in which there were songs sung that were Christmas hymns. And when it came time to say the name of Jesus, she fell silent. So here we have the example of another personal story in which my future wife kept quiet. It was a silent night. A third example comes from San Francisco, a place I studied. Kung Pao Kosher Comedy takes place tonight in San Francisco, in Chinatown. It's a night of Jewish comedy in a Chinese restaurant. And I interviewed people over 5 years as to why they go to comedy shows in a Chinese restaurant on Christmas Eve. And one person said to me, we're tired of being outsiders on Christmas Eve. We want to be insiders. We go to a Chinese restaurant where we can enjoy good humor, be amongst fellow Jews, members of the tribe, and enjoy good humor, family-style Chinese food, and we can affirm our Jewish identity. 3 different stories relating to being Jewish on Christmas. Maybe during the Q&A at the end of this, you'll share a story. I love to hear other people's stories. But these stories reflect different strategies for how we express ourselves being a Jew in the United States at a time of the year when we have a national holiday since 1870, in which it's a national holiday, the only holiday with Christian overtones, okay? And it's very apparent in the public square. We see Christmas trees in private homes and in churches. We see gatherings with a Christmas meal, services that have to do with Christmas and celebrating the birth of Jesus. And so we as Jews have to decide, are we going to accept Christmas? Are we going to embrace Christmas and make it Jewish? Or are we going to reject Christmas? And these have been our strategies in the late 20th and early 21st century in terms of facing Christmas. So I guess what I'm going to talk about briefly is how do we respond as Jews to the December holiday season? Next image, please. So here we go. Let's start in Europe. There's Western and Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, we had Jews since the 1820s the first instance of a person, Fanny von Ardstein, who celebrated in 1812 in her home in Vienna with a Christmas tree, the first case of Jews in Europe having Christmas trees. She was aristocratic. Her family were bankers to the Kaiser in Germany, where she was from Prussia and Berlin. And here we see a family celebrating in Berlin with a Christmas tree in 1912. This is a very well-off family because the Christmas tree is electrified. And that was also something unusual for 1912. Now, we know that Theodor Herzl, when he wrote The Jewish State in 1895 in Vienna, brought into his home on the eve of Christmas the chief rabbi of Vienna, who observed that Herzl had a Christmas tree. And Herzl wrote in his diary, I'm not sure what the chief rabbi of Vienna will say, but in any case, it's a Hanukkah tree and a solstice tree. There you have one example. On the other hand, we have a different example from Berlin, of Gershon Scholem, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism. He was born in 1897, and we know that in 1897, as he was growing up, his family had a Christmas tree. And under the Christmas tree one year, he was given a present by his parents of a portrait of Theodor Herzl, because they knew that young Gershon Scholem, the future scholar of Jewish mysticism, was ardent Zionist. But in 1911, when Gershon Scholem at the age of 14 took Hebrew lessons, he realized that Hanukkah was more important than Christmas, and he stopped going to his own parents' Christmas celebrations and went to his uncle's house to celebrate Hanukkah. I should say that in his diaries, Scholem says that they had a holiday meal with pork, they had carols, and they had gift giving. So they had all the aspects of a secular Christmas, though never of a religious nature. Contrast this with Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, the Jews were much more traditional, and they lived in shtetls and in cities in which they lived in ghettos and in Jewish neighborhoods, and they were much more religious. They did not study on Christmas Eve. It was called Nittelnacht, the night of no study. There was actually a prohibition. Every night of the year, every day, a Jew in Eastern Europe would study Torah or Midrash or Talmud, but not on Christmas Eve. That is because it was supposed to allow a Jew to abstain from studying at a night that might actually bring merit to the deity of Jesus. So in their case, they would cover mirrors, they would eat foods with garlic to expel the demonic figures who were roaming around, but there was a practical purpose. On Christmas Eve and on Easter, the priests in the churches in Eastern Europe used to preach that the Jews had killed Jesus, and there was a tendency for physical assault and pogroms on Christmas Eve. My late grandmother, Nechama Yanich, was born in a little town in Belarusia, in Novogrudo, and she remembers that dogs were put upon Jews on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And because people who celebrated Christmas would drink and they would actually carol from house to house, it was safe to be at home. And what did you do if you were at home? Next image. Well, you have free time. So there was a propensity to play games. And these games were initially played on Hanukkah. Here we have a beautiful, famous painting by Moritz Oppenheim, the Prussian Jewish painter. And we can see here that the kids are playing dreidel or some type of game with the dreidel, but the elders are playing on Hanukkah chess. This was a tradition to play games, gamble, and play chess. We have a famous picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in 1938 at a spa playing chess with his son-in-law, the future last Chabad rabbi, Menachem Schneerson, and they were playing chess on Christmas Eve. So there were games played. So you have these two traditions of embracing Christmas in a secular way, though not all German Jews did that, or abstaining and rejecting and shutting out Christmas and staying in your home. The Jews came to America. Then what? Next image, please. They embraced the traditions of the land. The German Jews had secular celebrations with Christmas trees like the Haas family in San Francisco, but it was for 70 years they celebrated with special themed Christmas parties, Christmas tree, lots of gifts, hundreds of family members, but never was there any religious overtone or undertone in terms of a religious embracing of the holiday. The Jews in America came to experience what Rabbi Bertrand Korn in in Philadelphia from his pulpit called the December dilemma. If we look at this chess set, the chess set here shows the dilemma. You have Christmas and you have what became Hanukkah, which since the 1870s, a holiday not observed in America. When the rabbis rallied against Christmas, they said, celebrate Hanukkah. And so you had this tendency for Hanukkah music and Hanukkah balls, Hanukkah parties, religious school celebrations, the commercialization of Hanukkah. You see in this beautiful chess set, the December dilemma, and you see here the Orthodox Jew wearing a kippah and a talit and a dreidel. And then you have on the other side, on the other team, you have the Christmas elf and the Christmas tree. So you have here, what's beautiful about this chess set is you have this image of the coexistence side by side of the holidays. So you didn't have to embrace the two, but you have the dilemma here, which Rabbi Korn said, do we reject or do we embrace the holiday? One of my teachers and colleagues said that since America observes a civic religion in which Christmas is a national holiday and it still has a religious flavor to it, the issue of Christmas dilemmas remains an unresolved problem. What I'd like you to take away from my presentation tonight is that is not true. We have resolved the issue of how to deal with Christmas. Each one of us listening tonight and our families and friends have strategies in which we respond to Christmas, and we make it something that we occupy our time. Sometimes we make it more of a Jewish nature. Sometimes we embrace the Jewish messages of Christmas, and we actually have responded in a way that is uniquely American. So when I wrote a book called A Kosher Christmas, I'm talking about how we make Christmas Jewish. And the subtitle is, 'Tis the Season to be Jewish. How are we Jewish now? So let's look at the next slide. So here we have, in the midst of all the music that was written for Christmas by Irving Berlin, a Christmas, a white Christmas, where he talks about neutralizing the Christmas. So it's this grand holiday devoid of Christianity. Then we have people who start making magnification of Hanukkah traditions. And here's a wonderful example by Woody Guthrie, the greatest folk writer and singer in American history. And he was married to a Jewish dancer whose mother-in-law was a great Yiddish poetess. And it was found in his archives in 1998 by his daughter in Westchester, New York, all these Hanukkah lyrics that Woody Allen wrote Hanukkah songs. Here's one called A Hanukkah Tree. This is the original handwriting of Woody Guthrie. It's his original song, and it was called Round and Round My Hanukkah Tree, Round and Round I Go, Round and Round My Hanukkah Tree, Because I Love You So. He wrote all of his Hanukkah lyrics in 5 days because he had gigs around Brooklyn to perform at Hanukkah gatherings. So the Klezmatics musical group in 1998 was commissioned by Nora Guthrie to put melodies to most of Woody Guthrie's songs that only had these lyrics. Interestingly, he did write music and lyrics for 2 songs, but this is a beautiful album, and no personal interest of mine, I urge you to listen to this album. This is one way of in his generation, embracing Hanukkah. By the way, he said, when I interviewed Nora, she said it was a Hanukkah tree, a Christmas tree, and a holiday tree. When Woody Guthrie was asked, well, how do you reconcile the three, all the holidays? He said, in his mind, it was all or none. All the religions should coexist or there should be none. So that was his reaction in his generation. Let's look at the next slide. Now let's jump forward to, we go through the 1960s. I don't want to really talk about it at length. Alan Sherman, Mickey Katz. You have this tradition of people doing parodies, which is entering into Jewish culture around the 1960s, especially post-Six-Day War, 1967. Jews felt pride in their identity. They felt open about expressing their Jewish identity. Here you have, in 1998, the culmination of that. These two young comedic musicians, Sean Altman and Rob Tannenbaum, performed at the Knitting Factory in New York, and they came up with this Hanukkah album called Hanukkah with Monica, alluding to directly to Monica Lewinsky and her affair with President Bill Clinton. And they talked about, they had a song here, It's Good to Be a Jew at Christmas. Their music was actually in the spirit not of Irving Berlin, who tried to embrace Christmas, the ideals of family and home and nostalgia. It wasn't in the image of Alan Sherman, who actually embraced Christmas in terms of making a parody with Yiddish words and Hanukkah allusions. He actually was in the tradition of Lenny Bruce. He was subversive, he was direct. He said that Hanukkah is better than Christmas, and Jesus was a Jew, and his songs are a comment on that whole idea. So this was a way of these two writers, these songwriters and comic musicians, asserting their Jewish identity in public at the Knitting Factory on Christmas Eve, and they felt very positive, and they weren't hiding like my grandmother did in White Russia on Christmas Eve because she was fearful. Next slide, please. So this whole idea of parody entering into Jewish culture, my favorite example actually is one that we all know. It's about Saturday Night Live and the creation of Hanukkah Harry. Hanukkah Harry, let's go back to the earlier image. Hanukkah Harry was a counterpart to Santa Claus. And in one skit on Saturday Night Live, Santa Claus was sick, and Hanukkah Harry was sort of like this image of Elijah the prophet. He came to the rescue and substituted for Santa Claus, and with his Yiddish-speaking elves, he went and delivered toys around the globe. By the way, this was not so original by Saturday Night Live. The greatest Jewish humorist of the 20th century was a man called S.J. Perlman, who wrote for The New Yorker. He was a humorist, and he wrote about waiting for Santa, and he has this Jewish image of Jewish elves making all the toys for Christmas for the children around America. But here you have it, Washington Square, part of a phenomena. I photographed this in 2009, where there are a few Hanukkah Harrys at Santa.com. SantaCon is a Paul and Bart crawl all over the United States in which people dress up in Hanukkah, in Christmas outfits, elves in red and white. And then there are a few people wearing blue and white like this gentleman. Let's look at the next image. Here we have Jews for Santa. So here you have this very interesting couple. And let's look at the next slide. And here's one I really like, because here we have Mrs. Hanukkah Harry on the right with the menorah on her eyeglasses. And on her left is Mrs. Santa Claus. So you have this sense of being out in the open. It's fun, it's enjoyable, and each one exists side by side, each proclaiming their identity, announcing who they are with comfort, no fear, and in partaking in the general message of holiday joy. The woman on the right, Mrs. Hanukkah Harry, is doing it from the Hanukkah point of view. The woman on the left, Mrs. Claus, is doing it from the Christmas point of view. So this idea of parody is throughout the holiday season. Another well-known example is the holiday of Festivus on Seinfeld, where they completely strip the holiday season of all religious overtones and make it an atheist holiday and airing of grievances. So you can actually come up with many examples of the parody of Christmas, which is done in a fun way, but in a way it's also a way for us to vent our feelings of dislocation during the holiday season. Can I see the next slide, please? So here's another example of how we embrace our Judaism. I call this chapter in my book, The Christmas Mitzvah. So since the 1880s, the president of Washington Hebrew Congregation, the largest one of the largest synagogues till this day in Washington, D.C., the president sent toys to the poor children in a shelter in Washington, D.C. From that day until the present, we Jews engage in what I call doing good deeds for our neighbors on Christmas, the Christmas Mitzvah. Here we have Project Ezra in Boston, which for almost 30 years engaged from 60 synagogues and Jewish organizations, Jewish volunteers who would go and prepare dinners, and they prepare Christmas dinners, even of ham and pork, and they deliver to the homes of people, and they actually deliver toys, and they enable people to celebrate Christmas. Here's another example from Washington, D.C. The JCC organizes a day of service on December 24th, in which they collect clothing and they collect things like shampoo or gently used coats, and they deliver them to people in need on Christmas Day, and they ask for people to volunteer. This is a 2010 invitation, but it's very interesting, and I, for many years, studied Project Ezra in Boston to see why people volunteer, and here's the reason they do it. Our issue on Christmas is this: we can feel comfortable at Christmas if we feel like our Jewish values today converge with Christmas values. So the idea of volunteering expresses the Jewish idea of tzedakah, giving back, doing acts of loving kindness. This fits into Charles Dickens' notion of goodwill for humanity, exchanging gifts, doing good for the needy. This is something we see as a mitzvah, but our relatives and our neighbors in America see us substituting for doctors who want to celebrate in hospitals Christmas. Jewish doctors take over. We see that people already in the 1930s who were Jews working the Postal Service substituted for their Christian colleagues so they could go home. We were enabling others to celebrate Christmas. We were doing good deeds. On the other hand, when there's a clash between what we celebrate then with Christmas and the idea of the deity, like tonight, we find alternative ways to actually make ourselves comfortable. So let's look at the next slide. So one of the ways we make ourselves comfortable is Chabad initiated in 1974 the lighting of public menorahs. And here we have Jimmy Carter engaging in the first president to light a menorah, a Hanukkah. He's lighting the shamas. By the way, a non-Jew is not supposed to light a Hanukkah. Chabad they denied this ever happened. I went to the Jimmy Carter archives in Atlanta, found proof of it, and also found that Jimmy Carter inscribed in his own personal diary for 7:30 on December, I think 17th, he actually lit the menorah, shamas, the middle candle. So here we have evidence of what then became a national phenomena, which actually led to cases in the Supreme Court, separation of the menorah from the creches. And I call this chapter From the Menorah to the Madonna. But this is one way we felt comfortable with dealing with the Christmas tree as we brought the menorah in courtesy of Chabad. Let's look at the next slide. And then in 1993, we have the first observance of Hanukkah in the White House. This is 1997. And Bill Clinton actually, this is very interesting, the person lighting this candle, his brother became the head of the Office of Management and Budget, Jacob Lew, under President Obama. At this instance, one of these parties where in the Oval Office they lit the menorahs, one year a little tragedy happened that as they were lighting the menorah, a girl's ponytail caught on fire. And normally I wouldn't mention this, but this year I read an article. She's grown up and an adult now, and she never lights candles in her home because she is afraid of the fire that was set when she was a young girl in the White House with Bill Clinton. So here you have this notion of bringing Hanukkah onto par, and here's how we make it Jewish. It's the festival of lights, the holiday of lights. Christmas is a holiday with a lot of light. And so our religious freedom expressed in Hanukkah has become an American way for us to celebrate the holiday season on par for us with Christmas. The other night on MSNBC, I heard Brian Williams at 11 o'clock announce this is the first night of Hanukkah. I was shocked. Why would he even say that? But that's a testimony to how Hanukkah, Kwanzaa
have entered the mainstream. Let's look at the final part of my presentation. And this is, how do we celebrate Christmas in a fun way? Well, we go to Chinese restaurants, and I have a chapter in my book called We Eat Chinese Food on Christmas. Here is a hoax that has been running around the internet for over 20 years. The Chinese Restaurant Association of the United States would like to extend our thanks to the Jewish people. We do not completely understand your dietary customs, but we are proud and grateful that your God insists you eat our food on Christmas. Happy holidays. So this is something that expresses this long history of Jews eating in Chinese restaurants. Of course, we like to know, when did it all begin? Well, we know it began, it was evident already in the 1890s. There was an article in a monthly magazine called the American Hebrew Monthly, in which the editors attacked East European Jews for eating in Chinese restaurants and defying the dietary restrictions of Judaism. Now, where was this? It was in the Lower East Side of New York City. The largest concentration of Jewish immigrants in the United States from Eastern Europe lived on the Lower East Side. The other large immigrant group were Chinese immigrants. These two groups lived side by side in harmony. And as immigrants started to leave the ways of the old world, of Eastern Europe and the shtetl and their religious way of life, one of the things they started to do was eating out in restaurants. They felt more comfortable in a Chinese restaurant because in an Italian restaurant, there's a mixing of meat and milk. There are pictures that have saints on the wall. When you go into a Chinese restaurant, it's a neutral environment. There's no dairy. So in a way, you're not mixing meat and milk. However, the food is chopped up, the vegetables, the pork, and often it's concealed in a wonton, which looks like a krepla, which is reminiscent of East European Jews. There are two sociologists who have called this safe treif. It's forbidden food that you're not supposed to eat, but we can't see it, so it doesn't matter, we'll have a good time. So this idea of eating out in Chinese restaurants was something that the immigrant Jews did on the Lower East Side, and the first evidence on Christmas Eve comes to us from that great newspaper. It's like the Torah when it testifies to when the first time Jews ate Chinese food, at least that I found on Christmas Eve, was in 1935. The owner of a Chinese restaurant in New York City, N.Chi Chuck, delivered chop suey to a Jewish orphanage in Newark, New Jersey. Takeout. It was takeout. Tonight, unfortunately, because of this sad pandemic, some people are, if you're having Chinese food, hopefully you're eating it at home. But that's the first instance of this, if we go back to our roots, was takeout to this home in New Jersey. However, over the years, in the 1950s, Jews would start eating out on a fixed menu in Chinese restaurants in Brooklyn and other parts of the United States. And there are over 40,000 Chinese restaurants in the United States today. And we go out to Asian restaurants. Many Jews then go out on Christmas Day to eat in delis. And it's become a day for fressing, for eating too much food and overeating. But why do we like to go to a Chinese restaurant? We go there because it's a place we can create a temporary sense of family and community. We feel like insiders. We're surrounded by friends. We're surrounded by family. It's a place we can feel like we've shut out Christmas, but we're part of the holiday celebration. So I studied Kung Pao Kosher comedy, this routine comedy act in a Chinese restaurant in San Francisco. When you enter Chinatown, San Francisco on Christmas Eve or for the 3 days after, there's no semblance of Christmas. It's Chinatown, and there are no crosses, and there are very few Christmas trees. And when you go into that restaurant, you're no longer an outsider at somebody else's Christmas party. You're inside, laughing at Jewish humor. You're eating Chinese food. And in the case of Kung Pao Kosher comedy in San Francisco, the fortune cookies have Yiddish proverbs translated into English. So it goes back to the parody, the humor, and the holiday. I want to end by reading something that was written in 1992 by two people. It's called Erev Christmas. It's a takeoff on Clement Moore's "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," which was written in 1824. And it's the source of many parodies that exist. In fact, in 1965, a parody of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" was written in Yiddish and appeared in a Yiddish newspaper called Erev Christmas. But these two people, to give them full credit, it was Bruce Marcus and Laurie Factor, okay, had an article published, a parody in the Boston Globe newspaper in 1993. With this, I'll end. It's called Erev Christmas, because I know the session after mine is Chinese food. So here it is, Erev Christmas, Christmas Eve. "'Twas the night before Christmas, and we being Jews, my girlfriend and me, we had nothing to do. The Gentiles were at home hanging stockings with care, secure in their knowledge St. Nick would be there. But for once the Hanukkah candles burned down, there was nothing but boredom all over town. The malls and the theaters were all closed up tight. There weren't any concerts to go to that night. A dance would have saved us, some ballroom or swing, but we combed through the papers, there wasn't a thing. Outside the window sat 2 feet of snow. With the wind chill, they said, it was 15 below. And while all I could do was sit there and brood, my girl saved the night and called out Chinese food." And here I'm going to jump. It says, "Our bellies were full, and at last it was time to travel back home and write down this rhyme of our Christmas trek and to privately speak about trying to refine our chopstick technique. The MSG spun round and round in our heads, and we tripped and we laughed, and gaily we said, and we slept all our leftovers home through the night. Good Yom Tov to all, and to all a good night." So there we have this sense of parody. And as I started with Good Yom Tov, this is a night where we, even in the midst of the pandemic, we pause for a moment to reflect on who we are as Jews. And we try and share in the holiday joy of the season by giving it Jewish meaning, a Jewish Christmas. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Rabbi Plaut. That was fantastic, informative, and entertaining. And if you have a minute or two for a few questions, we can take questions in the chat box.
Bring them on.
All right, thank you. So you talked about parody music. What can you say about the current growth of unique songs for Hanukkah?
Excuse me, one more time.
Can you comment on the growth of Hanukkah songs?
Yes, and around 1900, first of all, there's a rabbi in San Francisco, Rabbi Julius Ekman, a Congregation Emmanuel, the largest synagogue in San Francisco today, who railed against his congregation and said, "You're too busy celebrating Christmas, why don't you celebrate Hanukkah?" And so there was an effort in this country to magnify Hanukkah. And by 1900, there was an effort to write Hanukkah songs, add them to what were called Jewish hymnals, and a collection of Hanukkah songs, and not just songs, but plays were started. By the way, I believe I Had a Little Dreidel was actually in Yiddish. A lot of the songs we sing today are Yiddish songs translated to English, O Hanukkah. But, so I'd say around 1900, and then there was a need for some of these songs to be sung at holiday concerts. And there isn't a great selection. I know many of us growing up probably heard people sing our Jewish hymn, I Had a Little Dreidel, on Hanukkah, okay? At the holiday concert. We called it a holiday concert so as not to offend anybody, okay? So I want to fast forward because in the 1990s with this album by the Klezmatics and Woody Guthrie's music, we had all sorts of other wonderful songs. The Maccabees did a song on Dreidel. They did a song on Hanukkah lights. Millions of viewers, okay? Flori Jagoda, the great songwriter from Sarajevo of Judeo-Spanish Ladino music, wrote the song Ochos Candelicas, 8 Candles. So we have this tradition of new Hanukkah songs, but it's an outgrowth of the 1900s, where there were elaborate plays put on in religious schools. And as Jews moved to the suburbs, they had Hanukkah fairs and Hanukkah plays and all these other songs. You can see elaborate plays with children's roles for Judah Maccabee and the like.
Okay, let's hear. Many comments. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. Someone's asking about camaraderie between Chinese immigrants and Jewish immigrants.
So listen, a favorite story of mine is that, you know, they were very together, but the Jews who came into these restaurants in the early 1900s, into Chinese restaurants, were speaking Yiddish. And Philip Roth says in Operation Shylock, in his book, that the Chinese proprietors of these restaurants thought that the Jews in these restaurants who were speaking Yiddish were speaking King James inflected English. And they thought it was a very high up, formal type of English. Little did they understand that they were speaking Yiddish. So you had two foreign groups meeting in the restaurant, but remember too, the Jews never experienced any anti-Semitism or persecution in the history of China. So it's a very friendly type of relationship. But I know that every time I've gone into a Chinese restaurant, the document being Jewish at Christmas, and interviewed the waiters there, they don't quite understand what's going on. They don't understand why all these people are there. They know it's great for business. And here's the proof now. We now have data. For the last 10 years at least, Google has produced data for us that the highest percentage of searches for Chinese restaurants is on Christmas Eve. So that tells us that people are looking for Chinese restaurants. And by the way, we Jews have given this tradition of going to Chinese restaurants to the general population. It's become an American tradition too. But Jews and Chinese live side by side. I don't think the Chinese quite understood why there were so many Jewish people in the restaurant, but it was good for business.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Can you speak a little more about the experience of Christmas for Eastern European Jews?
So my grandmother, as I said, Nechama, she had she exemplifies generations over the centuries of people who shut themselves in Eastern Europe. We have very few instances of Jews celebrating Christmas in Eastern Europe. Didn't happen historically. I found very little evidence, unless people get converted to Judaism, okay, to Christianity. So you shut yourself in your home on Christmas Eve and you didn't study. Nittelnach, there were all these names. Jews never said the name Christmas. They had names for it, like Fearful Night in Yiddish, Blind Night, the night in which Jesus was born. And Jews in Eastern Europe, not only did they abstain from studying Torah, because when you study, it raises the soul of a person. They didn't want to raise the soul of Jesus because they considered him an apostate. So what did they do? They actually told stories of the crucifix. There were all these oral traditions that they would tell about the birth of Jesus, how he had left the stray and left Judaism to found this other religion that wasn't Jewish. And then they also had traditions. They ate garlic on toast because they felt there were demonic spirits around. And the smell of the garlic would repel the demonic figures. So, and then there was usually a ban on gambling, but you were allowed to gamble and you were allowed to play cards on Christmas Eve and then engage in other types of things inside your home where you were safe. You didn't go out. That was the tradition until Jews came to the United States as immigrants, and they remember persecution. We have evidence historically of a pogrom in 1881 that was planned in cahoots with the Warsaw Chief of Police against Jews and going into their homes, attacking and burning their homes. So this was not a night of safety. It was a night of fear, a night of danger, a night your life was at risk. Contrast that with now, where we live in an open society. We live side by side with our neighbors. We rejoice in their holidays, we rejoice in our holidays, and we respect each other, and we hope that we come together in the spirit of the season in ways that we find that we share values.